New Elizabethans with Andrew Marr begins tonight at 9 on BBC Two. Now, Joe Coburn with the very latest Politics Live.
It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tom Hunt, Shadow International Development Minister Anna McMorrin, Sheffield Star editor Nancy Fielder and The Telegraph's Madeline Grant. Today,
we are not going to let COVID damage the life chances of an entire year of students by cancelling next year's exams.
Pupils in England will sit exams in the summer.
Almost at a deal at all?
Are trade negotiations with the EU in their final days? And a vaccine in time for Christmas, but are masks here to stay?
I think those kind of habits that we've learnt from that clearly stop the spread of other respiratory viruses, such as flu, will perhaps persist for many years.
Well, let's start with that story there. You heard the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Jonathan Van Tam, talking about whether face coverings or masks will last beyond COVID. Let's listen to a little bit more of him.
Do I think there will come a big moment where we kind of, have a massive party and throw on masks and hand sanitizer and say that's it, it's behind us, like the end of the war? No, I don't. I think those kind of habits that we've learnt from that clearly stop the spread of other respiratory viruses, such as flu, will perhaps persist for many years, and that may be a good thing if they do.
Yes, it may be a good thing, or on the other hand, we may want to get back to life as pretty much as close to normal, but, anyway.
Whose side are you on, Tom? Boris Johnson's or Jonathan Van Tam when it comes to face coverings and masks beyond COVID?
Well, I think the key focus at the moment needs to be getting the vaccine out, and obviously, whilst that's happening, continuing to respect the social distancing rules, and of course, one of those is face masks. But I think long term, I think it's slightly for another day, that debate. But I think clearly in other countries there seems to be more of a culture of face mask wearing, even before this pandemic. But personally, I think in a year or two's time, don't want to particularly be wearing a face mask myself. And I think it will get to a time, probably in a year or two's time, where, what medical advisors say and scientific advisors say about what we wear and how we live our lives might sort of not be as stringent as it is at the moment. And I sympathise with what the Prime Minister said there. I mean, I'm a freedom-loving individual, and I think that though all these things are necessary at the moment, I long for a day where it's a choice that we can make ourselves.
Where are you, Anna? Will you be throwing your mask away when the vaccination is being distributed around the population or not?
Look, I think this calls for a very measured approach. It's fantastic news today, and the scientists should be absolutely applauded for their really hard work on vaccines. And they've done a brilliant job. But this is not a quick fix. And this is about taking that measured approach. We know, and we've heard this morning, this is going to take some time. It's going to be months. And the virus, this pandemic, is going to be with us for years to come. So I think it is about taking that cautious approach.
And long term, would you wear a mask beyond the pandemic, perhaps just generally?
Well, I think it's about looking at what people feel comfortable doing across the country. And I know that many people who've been self-isolating, who are vulnerable, would actually feel more comfortable out there wearing a mask. So, I think this is about not jumping the gun too quickly, making sure that this vaccine and the vaccine news is
and this is very much something beyond that. But you could see yourself, perhaps, and others, perhaps it will become a habit.
Well, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
But I don't. We hope that we're going to get beyond this where we are now, and that's the good news that we should be celebrating today. But take it with a pinch of salt and a bit of cautionary approach.
All right. Madeline, beyond the pandemic, though, in the long term, do you think there'll be a cultural change? Would you like to see masks being worn? Would you wear one long term?
Well, I think the key word there is choice, isn't it? I mean, I think we have picked up, I think the Deputy CMO was right to say that we have learnt some good habits during this pandemic, such as, good hand hygiene, wearing masks I think that should continue perhaps from now on. When people have a cold, they should be very careful about wearing a mask on the tube rather than needlessly infecting the whole carriage. There are ways in which I think these habits should continue in ways that won't become massive kind of freedom-sapping infringements on our day-to-day lives. But I would hate to see a long-term future that involved, ubiquitous mask wearing. I think there's huge issues. It's a brand new innovation for this country, and I think we haven't sufficiently thought about things like what's the impact on children having to navigate the world without seeing human faces? What does that do to emotional development? And also, what does it do to our society in general? I'm a bit concerned that kind of future could lead us in quite an atomised direction. But the fact that this debate... Yeah, sorry.
No, go on. Finish your sentence, sorry.
I was just going to say that I think this also needs to be seen in the context of worrying that, there's a mission creep after this pandemic is over, that the government, once it's got used to exercising big executive powers without the need for the proper legislative process, that it might, get a bit too comfortable doing that. We've already heard Matt Hancock talking about using the test and trace system to track people with influenza, for example. So I think it's good that we ask questions and prevent that kind of mission creep from taking place.
Nancy, do you channel Jonathan Van Tam or Boris Johnson more on this issue?
To be honest, I'm not sure we're quite in the habit of thinking masks all the time anyway. I still run to school gates and have to run back, get it out my coat pocket or get it from the car or something. It's not for me unless it's necessary. But I do think it's choice. I mean, the other thing you miss when you're just giving a smile to somebody in a shop, or when you're just giving, a quick exchange of words, it really cuts that off, doesn't it? So I think for human interaction, a lot of people naturally won't use them unless they have to. Obviously, we're using them now, but it does take a bit of a challenge to remember all the time for me. I'm sure it does for lots of people. All
right, well, we'll leave masks there just for the moment, and face coverings, of course, as the government say. And we're going to talk about exams, because Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, has been in the House of Commons confirming that exams in England will go ahead. Of course, it is slightly different across the other nations, but there will be more generous grading and additional papers to help students. Let's have a listen to him.
We support Ofqual's decision that in awarding next year's GCSEs, AS and A-levels, grading will be as generous and will be maintain a similar profile to those grades awarded this year. This is to recognise the exceptional circumstances that students and teachers continue to work under. Ofqual is also working with the exam boards to make sure students studying for vocational and technical qualifications and other general qualifications benefit from the same generous approach.
That's the Education Secretary. We have Dr Mary Bousted of the National Education Union with us. Mary, you'll have heard Gavin Williamson there. The exams will go ahead in England, but with these extra support measures. Does it have your backing?
I think the fact that we now have an answer to what GCSEs and A-levels, and we will have an answer to what vocational qualifications will look like, I think that's welcome. It's something that is overdue. Teachers in Scotland and Wales knew a long time ago what their qualifications would look like and how students would be assessed. And at a time when it's very, very stressful working in schools because of COVID, it is some of the stress that's been taken away from teachers who are really concerned about this. So I think that is very good that we have a way ahead. I don't, however, think that the government's proposals are going to create the level playing field that we all want for all pupils who are taking GCSEs and A-levels.
Right, why not?
Well, it's right that there should be more generous grading, that there should be more help in the exams, but this will help all pupils equally, including those who have not missed any school, including those who are able to learn remotely. But we know that last week there was just nearly 22% of secondary pupils absent. We know that that's a national figure. We know that in areas of high COVID transmission, the absence rate will be much higher. In the week before half term, the absence rate of secondary pupils in Knowsley was 40%.
Okay.
And we know that many of these pupils will be deprived, won't have access to laptops and won't have access to the internet. So even though the exams will be marked more generously and they'll be more helpful, there is still going to be that learning gap between more advantaged and disadvantaged pupils.
Tom, you're on the Education Select Committee. Do you agree with Mary?
Well, my view is that it's absolutely critical that exams in some form go ahead this academic year. They won't, as we found out today, they won't look exactly the same as they did in the years gone by, but I think 2 back-to-back years with no exams at all, I think would not have been a good place. So I'm glad we've now got the certainty from the Education Secretary we will have exams next year. And, you know, I mean, I sat down with some Year 11 students in a school in my constituency about 4 weeks ago, and they were very anxious because of the uncertainty. So I think in one sense they now have a certainty there will be exams, and they're also, ahead of those exams, have more certainty about what will be in those exams, so they can focus their vision more. So I think it's to be welcomed.
Right, but Mary Bowsett is talking about the fact that it won't be a level playing field. What do you say to that?
Well, I think the very fact that there's going to be this more advance notice of what's going to be in the exams will help them focus their vision more. So hopefully that will address that. But there is a huge job to be done. There is a huge job to be done because it's no fault of the people who happen to live in a certain part of the country which has been, say, more impacted by COVID and has lost more time because of that. So we need to make sure that everything is done to make sure that no child loses out. It's a big job, but I think we can do it.
Does that reassure you, Mary?
Not really, no. It's really not answered the question about the different levels of learning. I mean, we've got pupils, the government doesn't know, it hasn't collected statistics on 2 key issues. So it knows how many secondary school pupils are absent, but it hasn't collected that information in fine enough detail to know about the pupils taking GCSEs this year and A-levels, year 11, year 13. So we need to know how many of them have missed schools. And the other piece of information we need to know, which the government hasn't collected the data on, is how many of those pupils have had repeated absences, because we're hearing in some areas that pupils are going into school for a week, then either getting COVID or being in contact with another pupil who's got COVID, and then absent for 10 days isolating. And it's the disruption to their education which is so disabling of their learning. So we need to have that information. Now, what the government has done, it set up a committee which is going to advise it on learning loss. And what we're saying is that committee needs to be independent. It needs to be given the data that it needs to do its work. And its findings need to be honestly given to the government. And if there does need to be further changes, then those should be made in order to ensure that the children who are probably likely to be the most deprived, that they are not disproportionately disadvantaged this year.
Tom?
I think it is important that the government provides the data necessary, but I agree with you. I think it's very important we avoid disruption, which is why I was so perplexed by your union's position, which was to support the complete closure of exams during the second national lockdown. I think that would have been maybe a situation even harder for disadvantaged pupils and disrupted our education even more. So I find that position that your union adopted very hard to defend.
Mary?
Well, we didn't say that they shouldn't do exams during the second lockdown. We said that schools should be part of that second lockdown. And let me give the reason why, Tom. The reason why is that we now know that COVID levels of infection in secondary schools are 54 times higher than they were at the start of September. So I remember a select committee being shouted at by you saying that schools are safe and children don't transmit. They absolutely do. We know that COVID transmission from secondary school pupils into homes is 8 times higher than any other level of transmission. So we said that they should be in the lockdown so we could reduce the levels of COVID in school, so we could stop this completely unregulated, unordered system where so many pupils are missing so much education and the government doesn't even know who they are.
But you wanted them to miss more education.
What we have is schooling in many areas.
Well, let Tom respond and then I'll open it up.
Well, I think that, you know, as a teaching union, absolutely, you know, you are there to look after the interests of staff. I get that. Of course, that's a key role in what you do. But you should also be looking out for the best interest of pupils. And the fact is, it's been pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds and those with special educational needs quite often who have been disadvantaged the most from school closures. So I don't always think that your union has done everything it can to be constructive and to ensure that we minimise the amount of time that kids lose at school.
All right, I'm going to come back to you in a bit. Mary, stay with us, obviously. Nancy, in Sheffield, the situation there, how much school have pupils missed? I don't mean specifically, but are they missing an awful lot of their learning? And will those exams, even with these mitigating factors of generous grading and extra support, will it still be very difficult for them?
It's going to be incredibly difficult, but actually I think it's really important that they know, and they know in more time. This is enough time to get organised. It takes the stress off teachers. But what I'm particularly interested in, and the government isn't talking about this, where are the laptops and where is the internet access for the children who have to work from home, who have to learn from home, even if schools are in fully, which we know they're not and they can't be for a while. How are these children expected to learn? In Sheffield, there are approximately, the schools tell me, 11,000, just in Sheffield, 11,000 children with no suitable device, so they can't learn from home.
Well, even
when
now,
they're sent home
even now, they haven't got laptops.
Even now, we're actually in the process, our newspaper is in the process of setting up a charity with a security firm called Blanco and with a digital company called One Disco, because we're asking businesses to donate their unused, unwanted laptops. Every business has got them. The civil service has probably got tens of thousands sat there, so we can get them into children's hands, because the government said it would do this and it hasn't.
Right.
And I know children who, self-isolated for 3 times, 6 weeks at home with no learning.
Right.
It's absolutely disgusting.
Anna, I know you're desperate to come in, but I need to get a response from Tom, because the government has promised, catch-up funding, that laptops would go to every pupil in England so that they could keep up with online learning and also the work. So, Tom, what is happening?
Well, of course, the government have provided about £1 billion, just over £1 billion in terms of catch-up funding. We need to make sure that money is targeted in the right way, and that's something we've been doing with the Education Select Committee. There have been huge amounts of laptops which have been distributed by the government, and in a vast majority of occasions, they have reached the people they need to reach. But I agree with you, there have been some stories where this hasn't been the case, and when this isn't the case, we need to the government need to urgently get on top of it and make sure that every single child, if they are having to miss school, and if there is an issue of digital connectivity, that is addressed.
Just before I ask Anna, Nancy, will you get in touch with Tom, who's on the Education Select Committee? If 11,000 pupils are still without laptops, is this something that your committee can do something about, Tom?
Well, I mean, as the Education Select Committee, our job is to hold the government to account. So clearly it's something as a committee we can raise when we're with government ministers.
All right, Anna, I know you want to respond in terms of the general statement by Gavin Williamson. But first of all, in Wales, the Labour government there has cancelled the exams. So is that the right way?
Yes, it is for Wales, and we took the decision. We took the decision early on, and there was an independent review looking across Wales, and the decision was made to cancel exams. Now, in Wales, we actually have a whole lot more data per pupil than the government
because
do
it's a
in
slightly
England.
different system in terms of the way
it's a very different system.
Should exams go ahead here in England?
Well, look, I think what we needed to have seen was the decision taken earlier, but also we needed to see a different approach looking at different areas of the country, because what we've clearly seen from this discussion and what Mary was saying, which I agree with, is the disadvantaged nature across the country. And we're already seeing, I think Tom has got quite a cheek to talk about this levelling up and tackling the disadvantaged communities when his government is actually slashing by 80% the target to supply children with pupils with laptops.
All right, but on the issue of exams, because on the issue of exams, it's important that we get the distinction, because Wales, as you say, you agree with that decision by the Labour government in Wales to cancel the exams. It is a slightly different system. They are not going ahead with the equivalent of GCSEs in Scotland, but they are with Highers, and in Northern Ireland, they are going ahead with exams. Should the exams, and do you back the decision by the government for exams to go ahead in England?
Well, look, we needed to have seen a review of this and looking. I would like to see, rather than a blanket approach and an announcement today to say exams are going ahead, I would much rather see that this is a review, a panel looking at an investigation, looking at what approach should be taken.
So that would have postponed a final decision then?
Yes, it would. But this whole process needed to have happened earlier. We haven't seen Gavin Williamson for quite some time. OK,
Madeline, listening to the discussion, do you think that it's right that exams go ahead, first of all, in England? And secondly, these extra measures that are being put in place, should they have more of a regional variation to counter some of the problems that Nancy's been talking about in Sheffield?
That's interesting. So I'll answer the first question first. I think that they should go ahead. I mean, let's not pretend that devaluing exam results in some way won't have a material impact on students, how they're viewed in the future by employers and universities. not to mention the possible gaps in their knowledge. But I think that one thing that has really struck out to me throughout the pandemic has been that lots of the alternatives to doing things in person have been pretty rubbish, really. You know, the attempts to guess exam results and then changing the system various times until we came out with these predicted grades and so on. That was not an optimal way to do things. I think pretty much all of the problems that they're facing in terms of exams dates back to the government's initial failure to prepare adequately for having in-person exams last summer, which is something that you probably could have done quite easily given how socially distanceable sports halls and the kind of environments in which you have exams anyway. So I think everything goes back to this point about first-person methods, and a lot of this stuff is a belated sort of sticking plaster to try to cover up damage which I fear has already been done. On the point about regional, whether things should be managed regionally, it does seem to be that managing a big top-down effort of, supplying hundreds of thousands of laptops is something that is always going to fail if it's governed too closely by the centre, and it's an area where there needs to be real serious collaboration with local authorities and people who are a bit closer to the action. So I think, yes, Nancy's absolutely right about that.
All right. We're going to move on to another story that came out, actually, of Ofsted's annual report. Mary, I hope, is still with us. It was published earlier this week. And at the launch, the head of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, resisted calls that have been made to diversify the curriculum in schools in England by including more Black British history and literature from Black and ethnic minority writers. We're just showing you the piece in The Guardian. Mary, do you agree with Amanda in terms of sticking to it as it is, or should it be broadened?
I think this is a debate that absolutely has to happen, and I do think it should be broadened. I do remember when I was teaching that I was teaching in a school that had 62 first languages other than English. And as a head of English, I introduced a course on multicultural literature, on Afro-Caribbean, on Asian, on Chinese, on Indian literature. And it was hugely popular, not only with the pupils from those who had parents from those different areas of the world, but also with the white working class children as well in that school. And it raised results dramatically. The fact that those children could see people like themselves writing, could see characters who looked like themselves, who sounded like themselves in literature. And the great thing about it, more than anything else, it was fantastic literature. So I absolutely do think there needs to be diversity in the curriculum. I think it would be great if children could learn what Muslim scholars did and what contribution they made to algebra and to astronomy and to medicine, and to have, many people in the world, all countries, all nations have done marvellous things. You can't include everything, but it is much better if our children growing up in a multicultural and diverse world knows the best that has been thought or said throughout many countries in the world, as well as our own.
Tom?
Well, I think we live in a diverse society, and I think it is good when we're learning history or looking at poetry or whatever it is, whatever subject it is, that there is, but we do look at a wide spectrum.
But should it be diversified in the way you've just heard Mary Bowster? Because it doesn't look as if Ofsted...
My slight concern here, though, is that I think we should always remember that we have a shared history. And I think though you might have a black people or white people, what they have got in common is their shared Britishness. So I do think that we should always remember it's a shared history. And I hear about black history, but I certainly don't believe in sort of separating out white history and black history. And I also wouldn't want this to be part of an agenda to sideline some of our great historical figures and heroes, which actually I want every child in the country, regardless of what background they come from, to have access to learning about Shakespeare and other great figures such as that as well.
Right. I mean, is that what you're suggesting, Mary?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, I was an English teacher, and Shakespeare is absolutely something that is a shared cultural... Actually, Shakespeare is a worldwide shared cultural inheritance. But this isn't a zero-sum game. You don't do something and then don't do something else. You can approach curricula in a way that you do have a shared sense of values. And let's remember that sharing goes both ways. You share about the white British cultural inheritance, but you also share about the inheritance of other children in the classroom. And considering our diverse society and considering that we need to live in harmony together, surely that starts from respect, and respect means that you know about the best that has been thought or said in many different cultures.
Madeline, do you think there were issues that were underrepresented when you were at school?
Well, we're talking 10 years ago now, so I can't remember.
Not that long ago, Madeline.
But we definitely learnt we certainly learnt about the history of British involvement in the slave trade, although we didn't learn that Britain was the first to end the slave trade. So if anything, I'm not sure that we got the there was definitely no sign of jingoism and flag waving when I was at school. And I did English A-level, and obviously GCSE, and we had modules on poems and literature from around the world. So I think it was already pretty well represented when I was there, but obviously I can't speak for today's curriculum.
Listening to the discussion, though, so far, Anna, Amanda Spielman, the head of Ofsted, has said the curriculum is already broad and it's designed to give schools the flexibility to adapt to their own circumstances so they can vary the curriculum. Is that not enough for you?
No, I think we do need to see far more diversification and including, as we've heard, more shared history, more history of those children up and down the country, but also what makes up the country and where we sit in the world. Because this is not just about here at home, this is about how we act as a tolerant society at home and abroad.
Nancy, what do you think?
I think it's a little bit worrying when we're talking about broadening what we're teaching about, because to be honest, we're not talking about not learning about British history. British history includes a lot of Black history. It includes a massively diverse history that we don't teach about. And it's the same with literature. And the problem is that we're looking at this about changing the past. It's not about changing the past. It's about teaching our children truthfully and honestly about everything that took place in our history and about including literature and poetry and everything in that. And I think the discussions are still quite sad, to be honest, that we're still having this debate about we need to defend Britain and what it did. But let's just talk about everything that we did. That's all we're asking for.
And I think actually in Wales, what you've seen with the Welsh Labour government is we have a new curriculum coming in 2022. It's just been signed off, it's approved, and that has broadened to introduce Black and ethnic minority history, but also fairness across gender, across equalities, and but also in terms of climate change. And we know that is an emerging issue, and that is what children need to be listening to, talking about, discussing.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Mary, for joining us today. Now, the government's taking a look at toilets. It claims there's been a trend towards replacing female loos with gender-neutral ones and that women are likely to feel less comfortable using mixed-sex facilities. Have a look at this.
I'm not that bothered. I feel like as long as you're just going to the toilet in the toilet. I just think men tend to be a little bit more messy than women.
I personally don't feel super comfortable if there's like a guy that rocks up standing next to me. It's a bit uncomfortable.
I've walked into a men's toilet and I've been told that this space isn't for me. Gender fluid is the term that fits me best. I've always played with all the colours in the colouring box, really. I'm just Felix. I know there's just going to be one day that if I keep risking it, really, going into a men's toilet, someone's going to be frustrated enough or, like, confident enough, really, to something really unfortunate to happen.
For far too long, women have had a dramatic under-provision of toilets. Women have very specific needs. They're more likely to have urine incontinence, they're having periods throughout their life, they need separate same-sex facilities for their safety and security and comfort.
It's not just a question of changing the signs on the door. These facilities, public toilet facilities, really do need rethinking so that we can actually provide toilet provision that's safe, secure, dignified, comfortable and accessible.
I'm never going to say that women do not have a right to access. What I'm saying is everyone should. Any document that goes out by a government that's talking about public access to things that doesn't include LGBT plus people is anti-LGBT plus.
Anna, what's your view in terms of the government saying there has been a trend towards more gender-neutral toilets and facilities? Is that right, or should they be separate?
Look, it's very clear from your film there that this is, and we know that this is a very, very sensitive issue for many, many people. I think first and foremost, we've got to make sure that any language we use, any decisions that are taken are inclusive and also respect the rights of everybody.
And what would your contribution be to that sort of consultation?
So I want to make sure that absolutely everyone, no matter what their gender identity is, that they are able to use facilities, whether that's gender neutral, female, male. I mean, in my own daughter's school, they have gender neutral toilets. And they're very, very careful to teach the children, the pupils, why they've got those. And I think that's the important thing. It's about transparency, openness, honesty, but also talking about values and respect.
All right, more unisex loos, a good or a bad thing, Nancy?
I think we need to protect women's rights to go to the toilet and to be able to do what they need to do in the toilet. I think particularly in schools it's important. I mean, being a teenage girl, when your body changes and you start having periods, you do not want to be in there with boys. Let's be honest, it's a little bit of space that you've got for yourself. It's not much space, it's not much to ask for, is it? Everybody needs to be included. I'm not suggesting we exclude anybody. I'm just suggesting we also need to protect women's rights too. And I think toilets are pretty basic on that list.
Madeline, what about you? You will have heard there the clip from one of the contributors about LGBT plus rights and not feeling themselves under threat by perhaps being forced to go into either a male or a women's loo.
Well, I completely agree with everything that Nancy said. It's not much to ask, and I think that what's happened is there is a complex issue here about competing spaces, about people's vulnerability, and I think presented with this complex issue, increasingly the people in charge have basically put up their hands and said, well, our compromise solution to this is to make all toilets unisex. Anyone can go into either loo. But in doing so, it's women who lose out. They lose the privacy, they lose the security, and let's be honest, the cleanliness that many value about having these all-female spaces. I mean, it's ironic that I think lots of the many people agitating for this move would describe themselves as feminists, but as so often with these issues, it's women who lose out.
Tom?
I would have concerns if more unisex toilets means less, say women's toilets, then I think that could be a cause for concern. I mean, I myself am pretty relaxed about it, but I can understand why somebody might not be. So I think here it's about freedom of choice, and it's about respecting that we're all different when it comes to this issue. And I think it is a concern. And at the start of this clip, it said there seemed to be some single-sex toilets seem to be disappearing as there seem to be more unisex toilets. That shouldn't be the case. I think and that would be a cause for concern for me personally.
All right, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about Brexit and the EU deal or no deal. Intense negotiations have been going on most of this week in London. For the very latest, we can speak to the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg, and the BBC's Europe editor, Katya Adler. Welcome to both of you. So, Laura, how close are we, potentially, to a deal?
Well, Joe, this all feels very, very familiar. We are in what feels like the end zone. Everybody you talk to says, oh, it's kind of nearly there, but it could still all suddenly fall apart. And it might be late tonight, it might be tomorrow, it might all push into Saturday. It can't go on past the weekend. So forgive me, dear viewers, if you feel like you've heard all of this before, but I promise, really, really, this does now feel like the finale for all sorts of different reasons, not least because there's controversial legislation coming back to Parliament next week that the EU absolutely hates and sees as a potential deal breaker. And it just feels to me like if this is going to happen, all the pieces are sort of lining up, and there's all kind of nudges and winks and conversations around the place that tell us so. But it does not mean 100% that this is definitely going to happen.
And Katya, on the EU side, of course, here they'll be saying the EU must be willing to move a little bit and then we'll be there for a deal.
Well, I think the fact that Laura mentioned the controversial legislation that the government is bringing to Parliament next week is an indication of how the EU is feeling about this, because the EU feels that, yes, both sides have to make compromises. The EU feels it has already compromised. It needs to make more compromises on fish. But when it comes to the other big sticking point, the competition regulations, the EU wants fair competition rules in order to give the UK unprecedented access to the single market for a non-EU member state, and also governance of the deal so that both sides can be sure the other side will keep to the agreement or otherwise face big consequences. So they feel on those two issues, it's the government that has to hold its nose and jump. And so it thinks if there's choreography going on, that is being decided in Downing Street and not in Brussels. So I think we've had quite a few occasions over the last 2 weeks where the very, very positive, where almost their noises have been coming from the UK and not here, because the diplomats that I speak to close to the negotiations are a lot more cautious. But I agree with Laura. It could be tonight, tomorrow, the weekend, or frankly, in another week's time. The EU says, well, we can keep talking in the new year if we have to. But what it means is that in the meantime, as of the 1st of January, the two sides would be trading under World Trade Organization rules and would have no cooperation in place, like over how police forces would work together, or judges, or on social security matters or anything else.
Right, well, and Laura, on that, Katia discussing this idea that it could go on and things wouldn't be agreed and we could go beyond then the transition period, because we should remind everybody that the transition period, we are under EU rules and regulations until the 31st of December. It does end at that point, and the UK hadn't wanted and doesn't want to go beyond it. It also doesn't mean at the moment, does it, that no deal is completely off the table?
Look, it's certainly still a possibility.
Yeah.
I mean, the way it was put to me yesterday, actually by someone on the EU side, was the deal's basically there, but it could still fall apart. But I do think there's a difference of view on the different sides of the channel about the prospects of somehow just carrying this all on into the new year. There's a very, very, very deep reluctance in the UK to do that, not least because there's a real fear about what happens if businesses aren't given time to prepare for what leaving the transition zone without a deal might actually look like. So there's a very strong view in government on this side that actually the middle of next week, in fact, a cabinet minister said to me the other day, this has to happen by the middle of next week, because or else there isn't time to get it through Parliament. And if there isn't going to be an arrangement, then they absolutely have to give businesses, particularly small businesses, more than, just a couple of days, pulling the plug on Christmas Eve in order for them to get ready. It is also, though, worth saying that even if there is a deal, there's still concern in government that lots of businesses, particularly small businesses, may not quite be ready yet. Many business groups would say, of course, that's the government's fault for leaving this too late and not being clear enough about what's going to happen. But I think, as Katia was suggesting, I think there is a bit of difference in view on either side about whether or not you can really somehow leave this running, and hope that actually people would come back to the table in good faith after the new year. And I think if there isn't a deal, I think the UK view was not going to be exactly leaping for joy with the prospect of sitting down and breaking bread at the beginning of next year.
Katia, very briefly, I can see you're desperate to come in.
I am. It's not a matter of good faith. The EU worries that if talks break down this year, it's not that they're relaxed about just carrying them on the 1st of January. They worry that there would be a breakdown in relations between the two sides. Okay. And this would have a spill-on effect way past trade, such as how do you work together on the world stage if you're looking at containing Iran's nuclear programme, or other issues not actually being discussed in this trade deal, important to the UK. What would be the role of financial services? Could they have access to the single market after Brexit? And for a lot of our viewers, they often want to know, can they travel with their pets to Europe after Brexit, after the end of the transition period? What about access to medical care across Europe if they go on holiday? That is not being finalised in this deal. No. And the thought is, if you have this deal on the table, that smooths relations for other talks afterwards.
I feel another programme coming on, but I shall let you both go as the waiting game continues. Thank you to both of you. Picking up on that, Anna, I know you will want to see the detail of any deal that comes before MPs, but in principle, are you and the Labour Party minded to back a deal that's agreed?
Well, look, as you just said, we haven't seen the deal.
Of course.
I'm not going to say here and now what we would do, what we want to do, and it is just ridiculous that we are days away from crashing out with no deal. I've been speaking to businesses in my constituency who are deeply worried, people deeply worried. Now, this time last year, we had the Prime Minister fighting an election saying he had an oven-ready deal. And now we're seeing pizza boxes being delivered overnight through the negotiations with then nothing actually
the
happening.
sustenance was clear. We could see those pizza boxes. Well, can I ask you then about this story in the Financial Times, which says the Labour leadership is split on whether to back Boris Johnson's Brexit deal? Whose side are you on, if it's not too crass and simplistic to ask you? The Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, who is said to want to abstain and not back a deal, and Keir Starmer, who says we have to make a decision firmly one way or the other on this big decision.
Well, I would say neither of them have come up with a decision because neither of them have seen a deal. And that's what we are saying. But it's absolutely right that our shadow cabinet are having those robust discussions it is absolutely important and vital that what is in the national interest and what is in the national interest will be our driving force. And that needs to be looking forward at what sort of relationship we want across the world with trading partners, but also with our closest neighbours and allies, how we work together on defence, on security. And it's absolutely shocking that we are days away from a no deal.
Tom?
You know, we hear about this time last year. Well, let me remind you what was happening this time last year. Your current leader was travelling up and down the country saying that we should have a second referendum.
I don't know if you've noticed,
and we should
have
not
a new
respect.
leadership now.
Well, you're talking about this time last year. I was just reminding you what your current leader was saying this time last year. My resting assumption of the Labour Party and Keir Starmer is that he'll abstain and sit on the fence because that's all he seems to do. But if he does try and think voting for it's a clever thing to do, I don't think people will forget what was happening this time last
All right,
year.
I'm going to cut in here, I'm afraid, because we have only got a few minutes left. Because we're talking about Brexit, the leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, had said this in response to the news of the vaccine that we talked about earlier. We could only approve this vaccine, he said so quickly, because we have left the EU. Last month, we changed the regulation so a vaccine did not need EU approval, which is slower. He was then asked about it in questions in the Commons. Let's have a listen.
We've also had fake news. The approval of the vaccine's got absolutely nothing to do with Brexit. So I hope the leader is going to take back his tweet.
The UK should be really proud that our regulator got in first, and we noticed that the European regulator's a bit sniffy about it, wishes we hadn't done it, and that Germany and France and other European countries haven't managed to do the same thing. We have, we're leaving. Draw your own conclusions, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure the British public will. We are now free of the dead hand of the European Union and will be even more free from that on the 1st of January.
Is Jacob Rees-Mogg right, Tom, or is it fake news, as Valerie Vaz was saying?
I support the comments he's made there. I think isn't it tremendous, though? Isn't it tremendous that we are the first country in the world...
That wasn't what I said. No, I think everyone would support you in that. But this idea that we've changed the regulation so a vaccine did not need EU approval, which is slower, that's why we were the first out the blocks.
I think there's a huge amount of logic to the argument that if you are free as an independent country...
We are still under EU rules and regulations.
Well, because of the transition period, we've been able to... make it for our own medical body, and we've made the decision very quickly. I mean, this is an independent body. This is an independent body.
That's simply not true, and now you're spreading more fake news.
It's not fake news.
Actually, what was clarified after that tweet was that we are acting under EU law. And of course we are. We are acting under EU law until the 31st of December this year.
But we have the ability under a transition period to have made the decision.
Anybody was able to have...
That was what we were allowed to do.
Anybody was able to do that. What the EU, the rest of the EU has been able to do is work together collectively to come together on that.
I'm going to interrupt you two and briefly get a comment because we're almost out. Nancy, are your readers interested in this?
Who thought there was anything that would knock Brexit off all our frustration list? We were so obsessed with it. We were so fed up with the politicians backstabbing each other, fighting, and yet here it comes again.
Right.
Our businesses in Sheffield are locked down and they need help and they need to know what's happening and they need it now.
Madeline, just a few seconds left. Go for it.
Well, I think that the jury's kind of out on whether this was a win for Brexit. But for me, it was definitely a great example of one of the good arguments for leaving, because there is a precautionary way of thinking that dominates within the EU. And the fact that all the nation states have chosen to act in tandem on something like this, I think the advantage of being nimble and agile at a time like this is immeasurable.
All right, well, thank you to all of you. That's all we've got time for. Thanks to our guests. We will be back on Monday at 12:15. But, of course, if there is any news around a deal or not, we will bring that to you ahead of Monday. Until then, though, have a very nice day.
In the beginning, I felt unprepared.
It's not about death. It's about life.